But the next solid ship we have is the Warp Alpha, and then Delta, and all those jazz. Now this was a Warp 2.5 test ship and a Warp 3 test ship. So we've now finally hit Warp 3, and that's in 2143. Clearly Phoenix inspired, clearly. And that takes us back to the idea that actually they're testing Warp with the same iteration of, if the Phoenix was launched in 2063 and this was done in 2143, that's implying that they keep using the Phoenix design as the fastest pushing the boundaries, which seems odd to me given how much of a time gap and how many ships are in between. I mean, what's your thought on that?
My thought is they didn't really think about that when they designed this. That's why it's like that. But yes. This is going back to Zefram Cochrane's original calculations with that specific warp field geometry based on this size of the ship and the shape of the ship. And again, this goes back to what I suggested they probably do for the Phoenix, make it less complicated. I mean, I know those wings fold up, and I love the launch procedure for this thing where it's in a bay and it launches with using a ramp. That's an incredible idea, and I think the space program should initiate that as soon as possible. But I think it's going back to the original calculations by Zefram Cochrane, because he was clearly on the right track, and I think they've got kind of complacent in their designs as of late, probably at this point, just making small improvements. They want to go for the next step. So why not go back to the original genius that came up with it and start your work based on his calculations and warp geometries and things like that.
And I mean, once you, why not go with a test ship? Why not go, with something that can, once you hit that barrier, the right power flow, the right all these things, and then you can start building the bigger iterative engines. And obviously, we know, like I said in the story, it was designed to look like the Phoenix, and that was it. I mean, that was the precursor. But in terms of engines, these are getting very much like the NX-01, although they're bulkier. They've got other stripes, which do call back to previous pieces like the Emmet. I mean, it's nice actually, and I don't know how much this was really thought about, but there are pieces that link to other things, but yet they feel sort of more. This one feels put together, like it's been assembled rather than a sleek hull with all the pieces that fit neatly, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I can see that. Now, the thing you mentioned about the engines, too, they are bulkier, but at the same time, they're also shorter, much shorter than the NX-01s. And I think that might be compacting a lot.
And the Phoenixes as well. They're chunkier but thinner than the Phoenix.
Yeah. And shorter than the Phoenix, I assume, yeah? Okay. So I'm thinking there's probably the same amount of technology in there, but they've tried to compact it a little bit. And I think that's why it's bulked out, because you still have to get all that equipment in there. So you got to make them wider as opposed to longer. But
and it is a hell of a jump to try and hit that Warp 3 barrier. They hit 2.5, and they finally got to 3. And that's a big step. As we know, every warp jump, every warp number isn't a progressive step; it's an exponential step, and it increases the further up in the process. I mean, the Warp 5 jump is the big jump rather than as we know, it's a step. It rather than taking years to cross the quadrant, it can take now months, and that's a huge, more makes it more realistic to travel the stars and actually explore. So that was the big purpose of the next class. Yeah,
I agree. All right, so the next step in this whole process, if you are to believe the Kelvin verse, is 2149, the USS Franklin design. This was a Warp 4 ship.
The very first Warp 4 ship.
Indeed. Not a very big ship. It's very small. But an interesting take on things. I mean, it was kind of thrown in last thing, but it's basically the last thing they've added to the Star Trek lore. So it has been kind of shoehorned in here. But it does fit, in my opinion, as far as design and, overall, just everything. It does fit, in my opinion.
Now, it is worth saying that this is not the 2149 version of the Franklin. Now, I guess I made 2149 based on, it must be between Warp 3 and Warp 4, also Warp 3 and Warp 5, so that guesstimate that date. But this is the Franklin as we see in the USS NX 326 refit, the post Romulan War refit. So the engines would not look like the Warp 4 engines do not look like that. And it does not have the NX-326 or USS Franklin. I very much doubt it has the window. Although we have theorized on Franklin episode why that would include it. But the shape and the size, that's what we're looking at here. Ignore the engines because they are the post-refit. That's probably Warp 5, not Warp 6 refit. Shape-wise, if you take the Kelvinverse, those movies, this is the very first saucer in the Federation design aesthetic. I prefer to think the NXs, personally, because it fits the evolutionary step better. Although it's still not a full saucer, it's still sort of a three-quarter saucer.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of a small... It's now, rather than the two-man, warp test ship, and the Warp 5 was the Warp 5, first iterative ship. This is, now we're going to put a decent crew of 12 people. What is the most useful thing in the Starfleet, Starfleet now, is getting to our colony worlds. We're not exploring it. We're not battling. We're just, pre-Romulan War. We don't want to fight. So what do we need? We need ships to go to other parts of our quadrant. We saw the cargo ships, the Warp 2, they took, 6-8 months. Well, the Warp 4 ship would take a lot less. So, of course, it's a small ship, but hey, you can pack some dilithium on it. That dilithium, you can't just mine unless you have a specific ship for it, so you can take these, new processors, new coils, you can fit a lot of stuff on a small ship, and instead of taking that 6 months, you're going to take 2 months. So that your cargo ships are what you need. Transport ships is what you need. Hence this developmental step. So I see this. I'm fine with this being a first Warp 4 ship. I'd like to see the Prime version. We Hero Trekkers might do a kit bash of using a Warp 4 engine and nacelles on this piece and changing it slightly, but I like the idea of this ship. For the most part, and it fits in size-wise to me. But like I said, this is the JJ post-refit, blah, blah, blah version, so take that with a grain of salt as it deserves.
Yeah, and I don't think that there was a whole lot of these ships per se, and there were still the cargo transports, of course, tugging around, doing 8-month runs. The cargo ships could take the main bulk of the colony's food or whatever that it needed, but if there was an important... something they really needed, like you said, like the lithium power sources, something like that. This would be the ship that could run out there really quick-ish compared to the cargo ships. The cargo ship could be halfway through its journey and this could bring what it needed desperately.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think these would be running side by side with the cargo ships, obviously. And I don't think there would be many of these per se.
No.
Because we know that the original Constitution class ships, they built 12 of them.
I would have said half a dozen for these, maybe. That's pushing it, if they were successful. And, we don't know anything about the history of the ship, really. Apart from it was lost, and that was just one of them. So,
yeah.
We know it was the Starship class, not Franklin class, so there must have been USS Starship. So, it wasn't the only version. And the fact there's 326 ships is another interesting piece. But, Stuart, the next step is an interesting one. This we see in 2153. And this is the Arctic Explorer. Now, this is an Earth ship. It sort of breaks the mold. We don't know if it's warp capable, but it is another ship in the fleet.
Yeah.
And this is the ship that goes and finds the Borg in Antarctica, or wherever it is, wherever they were. But it's still a part of that evolution. So this is presumably an Earthbound craft, but I want to throw it in there as another one of those designs. What do you think about this in terms of Earth tech, even?
Yeah, I would say this is definitely for hopping around the planet. It doesn't have warp. I would say 100% doesn't have warp. The interesting tie-in, of course, with the NX is the deflector dish being the exact same.
That's interesting.
Why you need a deflector when you don't have warp, I don't know. It's probably a sensor thing. It could also be for to go to the inner planets. So it's got to go through the asteroid field, perhaps. That's why the deflector's there.
Well, I was going to say, why not give it, warp 1 so it can get to Mars? It can, if it's an explorer, why not?
But where are the engines, though? Where are the warp nacelles?
Well, there's a ship later on that doesn't have warp nacelles, so maybe at this point, this is almost 100 years after. Why couldn't you compress the warp nacelles if you're only having warp 1? I mean, every shuttle, after a certain point has very small warp engines. Look at the Defiant; they're integrated. Maybe they're obviously I could do other views of this ship, but I didn't for this. Maybe they're integrated. It's a good point, and it certainly breaks the line of technology.
I just think with the time period and the fact that the NX-01 is only warp 5. I don't think they have the technology to shrink the nacelles for warp 1 even down to where you can't see them or tell where they are. So I really doubt this has warp.
Okay.
That's just my personal opinion. I don't know if I'm wrong on that, but
I don't know. And it is worth pointing out that from now on, I've put the dates of when they first arrived. Now the NX-01 is already out here at 21. Because obviously we see this at a certain point, but the NX-01's, we see this in the show. The NX-01 came before the show started, but we know the NX-01 is warp 5, so I've put that at the end of this list because it must have come after all these other ships, because even though a ship might have appeared in Season 3, it's going to be older than the NX because it's not a brand new ship.
Yeah.
So disclaimer on that, these dates sort of become a little bit useless, but the order's still important.
Okay, so the next one, we got a day of 2153. This is the warp.
Appearance.
This is the warp delta. We've seen this a few times in the show, and it's a very interesting design. Again, harking back to that X-33, even the model that Archer was playing with, which we've touched on, perhaps that model was the early design concept for this ship, and that would make perfect sense.
Because I mean, this is quite a different design. It's obviously the Emmett refit. This is they took the warp 2 ship, whatever, and said, hey, this is the refit. This is the new iteration. It's got a few elements of the NX. It's got the aft glowing. There's a blue bit in between. That's the warp stabilizer the NX-01 has. The engines are similar, but it's out pointy facades, which are very different. But the hull paneling is very similar to the NX. That's the big indication that we're getting, 30 years, 20 years to the NX.
And I think that would indicate this probably has polarized hull plating, because it is one of the battleships of the fleet. So I think that speaks to that look.
I think this was just like the Emmett, the ship of the line at one point. If we've hit warp 3, my assumption is that this would have been a warp 2.5 ship that was then given the warp 3 treatment, and this was the I think it's around the same. I think this was in production when they were testing the warp alpha and delta. I think these are 10, 15, 20 years old at this point. I think it's the older, because it looks the most like the original designs. This is the oldest style of ship design. So my thought is that this is that refit, the iteration of the fleet, but it's still in use because it's still a useful ship. You put on new phased particle beams, you put on new shielding. This can still be in a system. And as we see in Enterprise, we see its first appearance is when the bird of prey, a Jurassic bird of prey, attacks the NX-01 right next to Earth. Well, this is the fleet that's guarding Earth. So my assumption is this is the home fleet, as it were.
Yeah. I would assume the same.
But then we take the next iterative step into the Intrepid half saucer, the Intrepid class. Now, clearly we're getting close to the NX-01 era here, because we have a half of a saucer. It's almost identical. Now, I think that speaks to the iterative step, from what we just had to this to the NX-01. And that's why I like the fact the NX-01 is the first saucer, because it's developing into that. But what's your take on this design?
It's interesting you said that. I agree with that to a certain degree, but at the same time, much like we see in the model that Archer was playing with, and the 2 cargo ships, this has like wing attachments on the nacelles, which almost seems like a design choice they were trying to enhance the warp field with or something. So this almost fits, I think, closer to maybe earlier than the warp delta even, as a experimental craft that kind of worked, but then they realized they didn't need that, because the model Archer was playing with had the little winglets on the nacelles, and so did both cargo ships. That's an odd design choice for me. You can't fit people in there. It's obviously equipment. It's obviously something to do with the warp field, I would assume. So it looks like that was kind of the design process of these engines. And maybe the warp delta was even designed independently of this, but alongside.
Well, let's back one track then, just so we can agree on something. Now, the literal design of the warp delta was the Emmett model rebuilt. Would you agree that that's likely just a refit of the old Emmett class? They took the hull, they didn't build new ships, they refitted. And that's why it's an older design, because it is a refit of the previous ship. And therefore this could still be a newer ship, but it's still an old ship, but the Emmett's still older because it's a refit. Because it's an older design. I can't see this being older than the Emmett, the warp delta, just the designs don't match up to me.
Yeah. I don't really know if I'd see the Delta as a refit per se. I think it's just a new design based on the older style. Maybe they did refit one or two of the Emmets to test the new configurations, but I think new builds would be made based off that design. I don't think they would have refitted all the older Emmet style
Well, in which
ships.
case it would be an older design, because you wouldn't refit and then after this you wouldn't build new designs, you'd just build these, wouldn't you?
Not necessarily. I always used to think that yes, it was Delta, then this, then the NX, based on that hull, the saucer configuration. But now looking at the similarities in the warp designs, I think that they were going for two different things at the same time. Trying to enhance the warp on this model, but we're still going to go with what we know on these models, and that was the Delta.
So it's like they're still building the fighters that are just forward fire, go forward, but now they're also building fighters that can do, a vertical takeoff. You're still building the old because they're useful, but you're also building a new style.
Yeah, you're experimenting and trying to refine things and get the best possible. This is the last time we see those fins on an SL like this.
It's true.
So I don't know if this was like the end of that design era, and they're like, well, that saucer works though, so let's incorporate the engines from the Delta configuration into, let's combine the two and come up with what we eventually get.
One thing that I really take from this design, you'll see in the scale, those warp nacelles are huge. I mean, they are the biggest warp nacelles we've seen as of yet. They are massive. Obviously, they're attached to the hull, which Doug never liked, but that's a separate piece. If you look at them, though, huge basards. The connecting, pieces over the top is very NX, but it's had before. But there is blue warp grilling in there, but it's all covered by more technology. Now, this really implies to me these are the big, these are the big Warp 4 engines. These are the big, both designed for, these can go out of system, need to have the armor, need to last a long time, but also need to push the bounds. Like, we are now pushing technology as far as it can go, and it needs to have a bigger bulk, which is why I when we do the Franklin refit, I'm going to put these nacelles on that ship, because my take is these are the first Warp 4 nacelles, or at least an iteration of that. That's my feeling on that personally, or at least some small tweak on these. And then we move to the NX Warp 5, they shrink drastically because that's the technology step.
Yeah.
Which is another reason why I like this as being an older design, because those iterations, pushing the design. But I do like this design. It's very obviously an NX derivative, and it's a kit bash based on that. But as a step, it's fascinating to see a half saucer.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And yet have that bigger tech. So it's both. But yeah.
Cool. Well, let's move us on to the next one. This is the Elite Observer, which we saw picking up passengers. This is 2154.
That's when we see it, at least.
That's it. Yeah, when we see it. So it looks like a fairly new build. So I assume it's a few years old, if not brand new. The interesting thing with this one for me is the integration of those warp nacelles. And do they have line of sight? Don't know. Probably not. Doesn't look like it. But it looks like a much more TNG version ship, and it kind of forgoes a lot of the Starfleet aesthetics we've seen so far, or Earth aesthetics. So.
Well, my take on this has always been it's a civilian ship. It's not Starfleet.
Yeah.
It's a civilian ship that was hired like out to. Well, exactly. It looks like a yacht to pick up. I think Emmett was the guy, the transporter, the guy designing the transporter, to pick them up and send them back. This was that. But what's interesting that is, you see the integration of the warp nacelles. I think it's clearly older than X, just because of it's just so different, but not by a lot. You're right. Maybe it's like a 5-year-old design, but this is how I see the Warp 1 engine, the Warp 2 engine. Now they've refined it drastically, and now you can get that propulsion. That's why I said maybe the other one maybe has a Warp 1. This is not a Warp 5 ship. Clearly, I very doubt it has Warp 4 or Warp 3. It's not going to have the highest. But a Warp 2 engine, I mean, this is only going to get to Moon, Mars, Pluto. And then if you need to go pick someone up, it'll take you a few days, weeks, that's fine. But it's interesting to see how technology has shrunk these devices, and that we are showing that a line of sight isn't necessary. And this is definitely a precursor to Defiant in terms of the technology being shrunk and integrated in a certain way. There's precedent for that, and people had those thoughts even back in the 2150s.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with all that, especially the whole, it's probably a warp 2 at the most.
Yeah.
But seeing these nacelles tucked in like that, I still don't think the Arctic Explorer has warp. Because
Yeah,
I think there'd be visible elements to that. So
this does prove that point, absolutely. I'm just saying the technology did roughly exist. Stuart, take us into the final step.
So the next one is the one we all know and love. 2151 gives us the Warp 5 beauties.
Yes.
You know, those ample nacelles. Anyway.
Truly a ship of the line.
Yeah, which is the NX-01, the Enterprise, the first let's get the hell out of our system kind of ship.
Yes.
So,
one thing it's interesting to point out is that this is the first ship to have an NX-01 or an 01 designation. And when we have, the J class, we have the Y class, we have, the SS, but we never had a number designation. That implies to me that every previous class, obviously they didn't go so far into canon to say Warp Delta, USS, whatever. But my interpretation from this could be that this is the very first ship of the fleet, that now we're going to make a lot of these as a fleet. Every previous ship has been, we're testing new designs, we're going to make a couple of these. This is the Emmet, this is the Geronimo, this is the Blerathon. You don't need 03, 04, but this is the ship, this is the ship of the fleet. We know we're going to make 6, 7, 8 of these. You need them classified. This is the step.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that it has the NX number. I mean, X we know stands for experimental. Now, whether this was the first ship that started that, so it doesn't really necessarily mean that in this one. Why would you launch an experimental ship before fully testing it? I mean, I know they did to get the Klingon back to Earth, or back to Kronos, sorry, but I don't know. I know later it becomes the NX as experimental prototypes only, but this one has NX for years, so.
And also we have the NX-02 Columbia, and then the NX Franklin. So, I don't know, strange. But Stuart, what do you think about this? The first Warp 5 design again. This is obviously a bit of a longer conversation to have. But look at the evolution that we've just walked through. How do you think it fits in?
Warped through.
I didn't mean to be that. Hey, I'm funny. Good. Must happen once a year.
Yeah. Well. Anyway, yeah, I think it's a great progression. The engines now, again, are faster, smaller, and sleeker, which is, it goes back to what I said about smartphones. I mean, once you develop it, every year it just gets better and better, and slimmer and slimmer, and sleeker and sleeker, and
until they choose to make it bigger and bigger to put more stuff in it and make a bigger screen.
Yes.
That's the Enterprise D of the fleet, isn't it? That's after this.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this is an awesome ship, and then of course we don't have it here, but the NX, the refit for this, where it became NCC. I don't know if it became NCC.
It became SS.
The SS Enterprise, yeah, but was it still NX?
No.
No.
Yeah, just the SS Enterprise.
Which is interesting that this isn't, because we had the SS Conestoga earlier.
But also that'll be a post-Warp 5 discussion. This is all pre-Warp 5, hitting into the Warp 5. One thing I've never thought about, and again, looking at this I think this must be a unique way of looking at these ships. No one has these models apart from the guys that worked on the show, and they've had no reason to go back and re-render stuff. The one ship that appeared in the tile sequence. You know what I mean? This is a very unique look at these designs and in high definition. Look at those nacelles. They've actually got the blue grill, obviously, but that's a common piece throughout history. But they've actually got those elements in front of them. They've got a piece, stopping them from being completely exposed, just like the previous half saucer did, which I never put those two together. But it's obviously shrunk. You got more blue grill. I never considered that. Obviously, then the TOS you can sort of justify it has some internal grilling, maybe, and then obviously other ships do. This. Again, as I said previously, the warps, the half saucer, we're now moving into the saucer is what we want to have for the primary design. That's where the living space is. That's, just the ideal styling. And I like this as being the very first saucer. And this is why, people say, oh, the Connie is the saucer and secondary hull. That's what all ship design has been. As we just proved, this is the first saucer, apart from the Franklin. That's a lot, 16 ships to get to the saucer. This was the first step of that, and this isn't that far away from the Constitution class, considering how many other ship designs have iterated. I think you'll agree with me, Stuart, that this says a lot about the Warp 5. Look how different it's the last ship. The nacelles, the pylons are pointing back. The nacelles are much smaller, they're further away from the hull. It's now a saucer, there's now a space, there's now a warp field stabilizer. So many elements have changed in this design to hit that warp 5. Do you think that's very much a causal effect? Obviously, we're putting more into it than was initially intended, but a causal link, is that needed to make that warp 5 barrier, do you think?
I believe so, yeah. Because we know that warp technology, if you have a fully spherical warp bubble, it has a speed of 0. You need to change that geometry, and as you change the geometry, you get higher speeds, which is a combination of, that'll be the warp sustainer, the dilithium crystals for focusing the energy, different shield emitters, deflector emitters, things like that. So this, I think, was so successful and such a big leap. I mean, as you said earlier, warp scale isn't just a progression, it's an exponential curve. So warp 5 is a huge advancement over warp 4, and I think this works so well that they started incorporating this saucer configuration into all other ship designs from that point on. That needed to go faster than that, because I'm sure that they still have ships that look very similar to some of the other ones we've seen, ones that are supposed to stay close to home, cargo ships, things like that.
Well, we see them, that's why I've got the models.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think this is that next step, that once they got past this threshold, once they broke this barrier, that it was just wide open for them. And they didn't look back.
Yeah, they found the key to higher warp speeds. And one nice little we all talk about how the TOS Constitution class is sleek, simple. That's its mark of technology. And I've theorized, the warp 7 technology is because they've had the extra plating of the nacelles to keep the radiation. You need to have that. This doesn't have the same piece, but it follows into more of a TNG. Both sides of those both sides of those nacelles have glowing blue coils. They're visible. It's complete. Factoring close to the TNG design, which was another advancement. So another step, another progression. Take the design as you want. Obviously, we know it's controversial, but as this canonical advancement, I think there is some. And again, this is sort of accidental because each one of these ships, they were almost made in a vacuum. They did sort of link. They had to be their own purpose. They had to make sense in their own way. And I like the fact that you put this in this line. And while we're reaching to some extent, and we have to because it's canon, I think there is something to be said about the advancement and things that tie and things that are happy coincidences. And I love that about Star Trek, and that's a lot of why the show can exist, that it makes some level of sense. And so I really hope you guys have enjoyed this look. I mean, Stuart, what are your sort of final thoughts about the pre-Warp 5?
A lot of variety, more than you'd expect when you first kind of watch the show.
Absolutely.
When you put all the ships in a lineup, there's a lot of variation. You can see the design elements tying into each other. I know a lot of them were designed after, to fit into for a specific episode, but the designers did such a fantastic job of making it like a linear progression. It all makes sense. There are, we are looking way deep into this, and a lot of people are going to say it's just a show, but
it is just a show.
We love it so much that we have to do this. I think seeing this progression to Warp 5 was very cool.
But Stuart, there's one final picture, and if you go to it, this is the fleet scale of everything put together, which again no one's ever really seen before. And I noticed one quick thing I want to throw in there. Part of the reason why I do think the half saucer is an advancement is because it's now got the deflector dish of the NX class, which implies it needs that for pushing higher warp speeds.
Or it could just be that they used the same model and just cut the end of...
But that's not what it does. Shut up.
I see what you mean.
Yeah. So what do you think of this? This is why I said that the different cargo ships are hugely different. And one thing I actually noticed, the warp engines are actually at the back of the ship. The secondary warp nacelles on the Y class. You can see them underneath.
Oh, yeah.
I think I have 2 sets of warp nacelles. But what do you think about the scaling of all these ships? They're not obviously time order, but pretty interesting. And these are the default scales of the 3D models when loaded together.
Way different than I anticipated, especially the Y and J classes. But yeah, you're right. The nacelles are on the back of that thing. I don't think those front parts are nacelles. So that whole argument we had, or not argument, discussion we had about different designs for nacelles is kind of...
Yeah, I think can separate and become a impulse only or something.
The interesting thing I'm seeing, looking at this picture, is the size of the Phoenix and the Warp 1 engines, and then the Arctic Explorer. It might be possible to fit something that's kind of a rudimentary warp drive into that, perhaps. But I think it's more just a planet hopper.
Yeah, I certainly agree. That's not the warp. That's the warp Delta. We don't have the Phoenix model ourselves.
Oh, sorry, that's the Delta.
But it's it's interesting. There is some level of progression. It surprises me how big the colony ship is. Actually, it's they built big, right from the start there. It needs to get to another planet, but that's certainly comparable to the NX-01 in terms of scale and those engines. I mean, they really bigged up those engines. I mean, the Emmet actually quite thin. The Warp Delta pretty big. That's why I said the half saucer. They are huge warp nacelles. I mean, they are really, really, really big.
Well, yeah. If you take the Intrepid ones, which are huge, like you said, but very reminiscent design-wise, look-wise of the NX. But you look at the Warp Delta, you've got the same size-ish as the NX. So it's like they took both ship designs and went, "Here's your NX."
Yeah, to some extent. And then you got the civilian ship, pretty big but not too big, and you can see it. And I think we'll do a whole episode, another episode about the evolution of sort of the primary ships. From the Emmet, which is a bit smaller, to the Warp Delta, which is a bit bigger, to the Intrepid half saucer, to the NX. There's actually a very clear size progression. That will be a whole other episode, and seeing technology improve, I think there's a very distinct curve there. But the biggest surprise to me, as I think we always said, was the cargo ships. I mean, that's why I think that the smaller one is very much more faster, but for smaller journeys. And that's why the more advanced first one, and the second, the bigger one, was for those. That is the super tanker. That is the hauling 50,000 metric tons of cargo.
Yeah, and seeing them in scale like this, I can see why the smaller one might be faster. Because the other one with the warp nacelles at the back, it's got to stretch that warp bubble quite a bit. So it might just be something having to do with that. So
yeah, I actually hadn't considered that, but yeah, it's older and faster, but that's because it's smaller, and then you have the older, so the newer but bigger, and you just can't hit those higher numbers. It's kind of impressive actually, manages to get such a high warp value, considering that it's the biggest ship in this this fleet by a pretty substantial margin. Yeah, okay. But yeah, let's close on that picture, Stuart. I hope you guys enjoyed this look at this fleet. Again, we're so honoured to have these models, to give you these new perspectives, to give you these new renders and this new journey, because we obviously love Star Trek here, and it's just as fun for us. I mean, we have never thought this through, because why would we have? And so we did this journey together, and that's why we love these sorts of shows so much.
Yeah, we always learn a lot and come up with new ideas while we're doing these shows. Like, as we discussed kind of in the part that's been edited out of this, of course, halfway through this, we're coming up with some interesting discussion points, which we never really considered. So this is always fun for us as well, and we hope that you guys are enjoying the ride with us. We love doing this kind of stuff, and if you like what you see, please hit the like button, obviously. Yes. Don't forget to subscribe. The little bell notification, you need to click that and say you want to be notified of every time we release a video, if you are interested in that, of course. So yeah, just share this around too. I mean, a lot of people love Star Trek, and a lot of people don't know about Trekyards. So if you think that they'd be interested, let them know.
And if you want to support the show financially and help us bring these shows to you every single week, there's two ways: either on our website, trekyards.com, click that donate button and just put in a one-time donation, or Patreon, which is our monthly scheme where you can support the show on a regular basis. Even just throwing the price of a cup of coffee a month at us will make a difference. If 10 of you, 100 of you help us out, and we can do this for as long as you guys support and do more and more, and we really want to do that for you guys and bring these new looks at Star Trek. That's what it is. Yeah. So until next time, guys, I am Connor Coggins.
And I'm Captain Foley.
And we'll see you next time.
See you in the new frontier. Warp 5, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.